Hello, everyone. Welcome. I want to tell you a true story today from Jesus' life that comes from Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through 41. And I'm not going to take time to read the text for you, but if you can find it, you'll recognize the story about Jesus and his disciples on the Sea of Galilee. Jesus and his disciples have been dealing with crowds of people all day long. On this day, there have been several confrontations, stress, rejection, anger toward Jesus and his followers. And now, at the end of the day, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let's go over on the other side." Now, even still, they did not escape the crowds because along with Jesus and his disciples in one boat, there were many other boats traveling with them. Well, they began crossing the lake, and the Sea of Galilee was about 13 miles long and about 8 miles wide. This was a large body of water. You couldn't just look across the lake and see the other side. The boat was probably a small fishing boat. The Sea of Galilee is about 600 feet below sea level, so it's low. And not very far away is Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon is about over 9,000 feet high, so it is a lot like Mount Baker, about the same height, a little less than that. So it's not unusual for the winds to start screaming down the side of Mount Hermon toward the Sea of Galilee. And before the wind hits the sea, it hits cliffs along the seashore and the winds start swirling and twisting, so it feels more like a tornado than just a simple thunderstorm. This was a violent and sudden storm. Mark describes it like a fierce gale of wind. And he said the waters were breaking over the boat, and the boat was actually starting to fill with water. These men were fishermen, right? They've no doubt been in some pretty serious storms before. But this storm was so bad that they began to panic. Now, Jesus was sleeping through the storm, so they woke him and they started shouting at him, "Master, do you not care that we are perishing?" Now, when they said that to Jesus, they were making two assumptions that we often make when we are afraid. First, they assumed that Jesus didn't care, right? He is sleeping. And what they thought, that meant he didn't care about their problem. That's why they said that. Jesus, do you not care? Okay? This is a belief, an assumption they made about God. In order to avoid this kind of mistake, we have to spend time before the crisis filling our minds with the truth of God as it is revealed in his word. Well, the second assumption they made, they assumed that they were dying. They immediately assumed that the worst thing that could happen in their minds was already happening. Do you not care that we are perishing, we are dying? And that's one of the basic ingredients of fear, right? Assuming the worst. Having our eyes on our circumstances and assuming that the worst thing that could happen is already happening. Well, Jesus got up, he rebuked the wind, he said to the sea, "Hush, be still." And Mark tells us that when Jesus said that, the wind died down and became perfectly calm immediately. Now, normally, a storm sort of gradually subsides. The winds get less and less, the waves calm gradually, and the calm is restored. But under the command of God, this storm stopped faster than it came. It came suddenly, but it stopped instantly without any hesitation. And then Jesus had something to say to his disciples. He asked them, "Why are you afraid?" Now, Jesus knew why they were afraid. He knew the answer to that question. And then he answered this question with another question. How is it that you have no faith? You see, Jesus knew their hearts. He knew that what they needed right then was to grow in their faith, to increase their faith. The reason they were afraid was because their hearts were not being controlled or led by faith. Well, Mark explains what happened next in the hearts of these disciples in verse 41. As Matthew tells the story, he says the men marveled. They were amazed at what they had seen that night. Mark says they were afraid. Their hearts were filled now with fear of God. They've changed, right? Instead of being afraid of their circumstances, now they have fear of God. And that's exactly what needed to happen. We live in times where we're tempted and where we face a lot of fear and anxiety. And what God wants us to do is to fill our minds and hearts with the truth about God. Resist the temptation to assume that God doesn't care. Resist the temptation to assume that the worst thing that could happen is already happening or going to happen. And instead, let's fill our hearts and minds with the truth that God does care. He is here. He is able to lead us through even great times of suffering and trial. That's what the disciples learned from Jesus that night on the Sea of Galilee.